Thank you, Simon. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are delighted that you can join us today as we explore the role of technology in addressing and potentially eradicating greenwashing. Today's seminar is the second in a three-part series hosted by IDA Ireland in partnership with Catalina Consulting and London media house IFI Global. And a post-series white paper will be shared with all registered delegates. I'm Karina Vaughan and Catalina Consulting is my company. We are a London-based advisory firm specialising in strategic business growth in the financial and technology sectors. And it's been our pleasure to work with IDA Ireland on this ESG focused series of events. Today's theme is current and highly topical, judging by the number of sustainability leaders in our audience. For a long time now, we've been accustomed to the term greenwashing in corporate performance reporting. But over the last year, the doubling of investments in sustainable and ESG funds to a record $51 billion has made greenwashing key to the investment lexicon. And so as the green marketing machine promotes even more eco-friendly and socially responsible products, more of us are asking for evidence to back up marketing spin. And providing insights into how this might be achieved will be our excellent panel, who you will meet shortly. So if you have a question or a comment for the panel, please submit them as we go using the Q&A button. We will try to get to as many of them as we can before our 3 o'clock close. We will also launch a poll just before our panelists make their opening remarks. This is an anonymous poll and we will use the output of it in our white paper. Next week, we will send out a recording of this session along with an invitation to join the final seminar in the series on the impact of ESG on service providers. And that will be on the 17th of June, again at 2 o'clock. I will now hand you over to our moderator for the seminar, Simon Osborne, CEO of IFI Global. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karina, and also thank you very much for joining us today. And also thanks to the IDA very much for sponsoring this particular event. As Karina says, I'm the CEO of IFI Global, which is a research and media house based in the City of London. And one of our 3 monthly publications specializes upon the impact of ESG on the asset management industry. And that publication is growing quite quickly at the moment. And next month, for example, we are launching an ESG risk management forum that will be covering greenwashing in a lot of detail on a very regular basis, and a whole host of other things that go into making risk management in the ESG era an awful lot more complex than it has been in the past. So on the panel today, we have Bobby Consol-Verma. He is the CEO of OneFS Wealth. We have Ronan Crossan, who's the Director of Data Strategy and Analytics at Eagle Alpha. We have Owen Fahy, who's Head of Responsible Investing at KBI Global Investors. And we have Kate Solovinia, who's the VP Financial Services at the IDA. We're going to get into the panel chat with them in a few minutes, but first I'm going to put up a few scene-setting slides that I hope will help inform the discussion today. And as Karina has just said, please do take advantage of the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen to send in questions as we go along. We'll try and take a few of those, but we will all, as we go along, but we will also reserve a little bit of time at the end for more questions more formally. Right, so for some reason it's not changing. It's interesting. Oh, great, finally, it's clicked into action. So I thought it would be useful for those of you perhaps who aren't quite as close to ESG as some of us are, to give you this bit of background on what ESG is and where it's come from. You could actually call, as some people have, ESG is moral capitalism. It effectively dates back to the Quaker, the start of the investing in for moral or social responsible reasons dates back to the Quakers in the 1880s. More recently, more formally, the official period when it actually properly started was when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN in the mid-noughties, and he came up with the PRI, which, as I'm sure you all know, stands for the Principles for Responsible Investing. And it's worth noting that institutions that have signed up to the UN's PRI have over $70 trillion in assets. And investment houses, the BlackRocks of this world and all the usual suspects, they have also, of course, all signed up to the UN's PRI as well. And they have between them over 100 trillion in AUM too. Doubtless between the two figures there's a lot of double counting, but you can just get a sense from that how big this has become. I like this very specific figure that Bloomberg Intelligence put up at the beginning of this year. They have forecast that by their definition of ESG assets, the figure will be $53 trillion by the year 2025, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 30, 35 trillion today. So they're expecting very substantial growth for the next few years. But it really does depend, and this is what we're going to be in effect getting into in a second, it really does depend on what is counted. And doubtless in those extraordinarily huge figures I've just been quoting, there is a lot of greenwashing, and that is what we're really going to be discussing today. So what is greenwashing? Well, the term actually has been around for a very long time, longer indeed than ESG investing has been around. It was practiced by corporates when going back even to the 1980s, when even the Unilevers, the Procters and Gambles of this world started jumping on the green bandwagon. Of course, there was nothing to back it up, but they were trying to say this product of theirs, whatever it may be, was greener than whatever else it was in the market. And more recently, the greenwashing term of abuse has been directed at fund managers, which is where it comes for us as our business much more interesting. And an example of that, there are several examples I'm going to come up with, but an example of that is, and I better not name the names, we don't want to get sued for this webcast today, but a number of managers, indeed one might say many managers, have rebranded old funds of theirs as sustainable because they might have some ecological aspect to their portfolio, but only one of many parts of it and not necessarily the others. But they've been able, the point is, until now, they've been able to get away with it by just calling something ESG or environmental or sustainable or whatever it may be, because it's been incredibly difficult, verging on impossible, to really find out how sustainable that particular product is. And I absolutely love this quote that I just found the other day in preparation for this event today from somebody called Molly Scott Cater, who's a professor of green economics. When people found there was horse meat rather than beef in their lasagna, there was an outcry. But when the equivalent happens in the financial sector, as it has for years, customers don't even have the right to know. I thought that would set up our conversation about greenwashing perfectly today. So what we're really going to get into in a minute when we get to the panel is what are or are the solutions to greenwashing. We're going to talk about regulation, and clearly, as doubtless most of you know, we have the SFDR coming along, so we'll touch upon that. Definitely we'll be talking about data. That's perhaps more of a private, obviously a private sector solution. Better due diligence by investors, incredibly important too. I was talking to a very good friend of mine who runs a very successful due diligence firm for institutional investors. His clients are all over the world. He's based in Montreal. And he was saying the ESG due diligence side of what he does is growing very quickly indeed. Investors from Australia to Canada to Northern Europe and to even the States, everywhere, want that kind of service. And that's great for the big institutional investors, but what about the retail investors? That's obviously something they can't do. And the final point on this slide, which I think for me is the most important thing of all, is can there or will there or could there be a change of culture at investment houses? In the preparation for this event today, when we had our prep call, we came up with the term, and I'm going to be using it a lot in future, I warn everyone, governance washing, to go along with greenwashing and social washing. I think the fund industry is very guilty of what might be termed governance washing. What is governance washing? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. The fund industry, I'll give you one example, Goldman Sachs specifically, has gone out there and said it will not invest in any corporates unless there are at least one woman on the board of that particular corporate. No women, no money. But if you look at the fund industry, as we do from another of our publications called The NED, which focuses upon fund governance, you will see that the number of women on boards is really, by comparisons with other industries today, frankly, pretty pathetic. The number of funds in international jurisdictions that have women on their boards is 19, that's 19%. Even recently in the UK, when the FCA mandated the authorised fund managers to add 2 independents to their boards, which was only in the last couple of years, so long since all this started, a lot of them did not choose to put any women on the boards where there weren't any already. So we still have to, and we're talking about in the last few months when we did some analysis on this, something like 25% of the UK authorised fund managers have no women on their boards at all, and another roughly 25% only have one. So therefore, roughly half have one or none when these boards are about 8 in total. Yet they're going out there, and it's not just Goldman Sachs, it's many others as well, saying, oh, you've got to be more diverse if you want our money. Another example of this might be the fact that at least the European fund industry is incredibly peripatetic. You have the manager often in London, you have the back office maybe in Dublin, you have the distributors all over the place, you have the custodians somewhere else, you have, goodness knows, the directors all over the world. The carbon footprint is absolutely enormous, and the carbon footprint probably of putting together an ESG fund is also absolutely enormous. And in many ways, the fund industry is a bit like, in some cases, not in every case, you know, a celebrity that hires a private jet to shoot off to the other side of the world to join some environmental event. So the industry, I think, is responsible, is guilty, I should say, for a lot of governance washing. And hopefully that will change as the younger generation come through. When that change of culture happens at investment houses, then I really think we will get a big reduction in the greenwashing problem. So questions for today, and there are going to be many questions as we get into the panel. These are the 4 big ones I want to direct the panel to. Is the SFDR and other regulations going to be the solution to the greenwashing problem? And will the SFDR or something very much like it be adopted in the Anglo-Saxon countries, which is of course where most fund managers are based, either in the UK or the US? Can we, what can better data achieve, and will there ever be a commonly accepted industry standard? Again, we're going to get very much into the data side. And aside from relying on data, which currently anyway is somewhat patchy, it's certainly not uniform, what can investors do in terms of the due diligence regarding greenwashing? And what about retail investors? How are they going to do something about it? And finally, coming back to my previous point about governance washing, what chance of a change of culture in the fund industry? So that's enough for me for the time being. I'm now going to stop sharing screen. Great, the panel is coming up. I'm going to make Karina the host, and she can launch the poll she was talking about. Hang on a second, Karina. Make host, there you are. And it's all over to you.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I'll just quickly answer one of the questions that has already come in asking about the slides. Simon, will we be able to circulate the slides also after the webinar? And I think it's safe enough for me to say yes to that.
Yep. course.
Okay, so yes, we will share the slides along with a recording and an invitation to the next session. So I'm now, technology willing, going to launch the poll.
Well, I've never seen this before. This is very exciting.
It's only exciting when it works. So I will just give you a few seconds to quickly respond to that.
Can they respond whilst we talk, or do we have to wait for them to do that before we carry on talking?
So it looks like everyone has pretty much made their selection. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for doing that. We will be including the output of that in the white paper. And I'm just going to end the poll now.
Okay. So let's get back to the panel. And Kate, can I come to you first for your opening comments?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Karina and Simon, for the great introductions. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here to be discussing this very important topic. So as Simon has introduced me, my name is Kate and I'm based in our Paris office. I manage the European Financial Services portfolio for IDA Ireland. IDA is the Irish government's inward investment agency, and we support international companies who are looking to internationalize and grow their business, and also to find the right talent for their teams. We have over 430 global financial services clients within our portfolio currently, and they employ over 50,000 people in Ireland. Among them, many of you will know the great European and UK brand names such as Amundi, BNP Paribas, Barclays, Zurich, Deutsche Börse, Ultradomus, HSBC. So across the really banking, insurance, asset management, fund servicing, payment spaces. What we see in recent years and months in particular is that a lot of these clients, and not just financial services clients, but actually across the board, because we do work over 9 different sectors and industries, is that the climate change and really the broader ESG agenda has recently come to dominate a lot of corporate strategies and also client conversations.
I don't know whether that's just me, but it seems like Kate has just frozen. Is that the same for everybody else?
Yeah. Yes.
Perhaps we'll come back to Kate in a minute then. Roland, can we come to you?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, Simon, thank you very much for the invite. Thanks, IFI Global, IDA Ireland and Catalina Consulting. I guess if the questions around, greenwashing and can the problem be solved, and I think it's very tempting for me to say that it's all about the data and it's a data problem, given that Eagle Alpha are a data company or a data aggregator. I think data certainly is part of the solution. I think more mandatory disclosures from firms, more frequent, timely data is important. And also, I think for fund managers specifically, I think the use of more external or alternative data and not just relying on company data or company statements is important. But I don't think it's just about data. I think it's a question of definition as well. What is, how do we define greenwashing? There's a very active conversation in the fund industry around funds that invest in an energy company, for example, and then engage with that company to encourage them to become more green. Is that greenwashing? I know it gets headlines if a green fund seem to have an energy company as part in the portfolio. So I think the definition is a challenge here, and then I think it's also, I think greenwashing is a question of incentives. You are what you measure, and we need to be very clear on what we want to measure. And this comes to the question of regulations and guidelines that, with good intentions, can sometimes create perverse incentives. So that's kind of my opening. I think data is certainly important, and definitely keen to get into that topic, but I think it's broader than a data question.
Bobby, can I come to you next? But before you do say anything, just to Kate, to let you know, you froze for a minute, so we carried on without. We'll come back to you perhaps at the end, and hope, God willing, that you've fixed that problem. So, Bobby, over to you.
Perfect.
Sure.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Kate. It's a great topic to be talking about. And just really quickly, what I wanted to flag is my background is 25 years of capital markets and private equity. And the reason I flag that is because I remember presenting on ESG about 10 years ago. And that was when I was running a fund. And the fund was actually all about, the strategy at the time was for that fund was primary, secondary, tertiary agriculture. And so we were talking about sustainability, and to be frank, no one really cared. And it was really interesting. It's been really interesting to see how that's evolved over time, and how topical ESG is, and clearly we've seen this in the press so much recently, and I think that's a really good thing. And my final point is by way of introduction, is that I think it's so important that we actually engage both the technology providers from a data context, and then also the regulators. I think that the regulators are really instrumental in actually forging ahead with recognition of ESG issues. And then the third leg, if you like, is the consumer. And Simon, you mentioned this. I think the retail angle is so important, because without having that engagement from the consumer side, none of this will really work. And I think we need to actually take those factors into account. So thank you.
Very, absolutely. Owen, can I come to you?
Thanks. Yeah, we just to set the scene of who we are, and therefore the angle I'm coming at on this, I suppose. We are an Irish-based investment manager. We have a global client base, though, despite the fact that we're located in Ireland, our clients are very much global, and we invest, importantly, only in listed equities. So we very much specialize in equities and listed or public equities. So we're not, for example, in the private equity space or so on. We've been doing, for want of a better word, doing ESG. It's not the right technical term, but it's probably the easiest way of explaining it for a long time. We launched our first thematic ESG funds back in the year 2000. So this is a topic that's very important to us. And it's something that's been at the core of what we do for a long time. So of course, from our point of view, the very fact that people are talking about greenwashing in a sense is a good thing, because it shows that people are concerned to distinguish between what you might call real or ESG funds, for want of a better way of putting it, and the greenwashers. So in that sense, it's welcome. Where I have as many questions, if not more questions, than answers on these issues. And one of the things that certainly strikes me is the huge difference between the retail and the institutional market. We sell our products, our investment products, to some of the largest investors in the world, on the one hand, who really have absolutely no interest in the regular, or very little in whether we comply with this, that, or the other label, for example, or indeed in regulatory issues like Article 8 or Article 9 or Article 6 or any of these things are similar. They get to know us and our products in intimate detail, for a better way of putting it, where they really kick the tires, and they know by the time they have done their due diligence on us, they know without the slightest shadow of a doubt whether our funds are sustainable or not, or whether they are what they say on the tin, or whether we're greenwashing. I won't say it's easy for them, because they put a lot of resources and effort into making sure of that. But that part of the market is probably not that interested in a lot of what we're talking about, I think, actually today, because they do their own due diligence, and it's not really about data, and it's not about regulation, it's not about anything, it's about them doing their own work. But on the other hand, we, like many investment managers, also sell our products indirectly in our case, but nonetheless we sell them to the retail side of the market. And there's much more of an issue, because there's no doubt that, you know, it seems to me that as you look around Europe in particular, which I'd be slightly more familiar with, but even in the US, that funds are going into funds, investments are going, cash flow is going in, AUM is going into products simply because they have the word sustainable, or they have the word ESG, or they have the word green in them. And there's not much more analysis than that in some cases. So in that area, I do see where perhaps data products, where regulation, where labels, and all those other tools that are designed to get rid of greenwashing have a use, an important use. They're not perfect, but they're helpful, and we can discuss that in more detail. And the final point I suppose I would make is that I don't think we should naturally assume, almost as a default point of view, that all investment managers in the world or even most are determined to try and pull a fast one on investors. I mean, all investment managers, I think, are going in the right direction with regard to sustainability. You only had to see the dramatic news on climate change and proxy voting that we don't try to get into, but all that news yesterday about where at least two board members from Exxon were fired because Exxon wasn't doing enough about climate change, and the Dutch climate, you've seen a case in the Dutch courts, and you saw a resolution on Chevron. Anyway, all sorts of interesting developments yesterday that showed even the biggest investment funds in the world, and the smallest, and those that have traditionally had a strong view in ESG and responsible investment, and those that haven't, are increasingly coming to the view that something has to be done about sustainability issues, and are putting their money where their mouth is, and are putting their votes where their sentiment is. So I don't think we should start with the point of view that investment managers are trying to pull a fast one. I think actually investment managers are generally trying to do the right thing, but there are certain areas where better data, better regulation could help solve some of the greenwashing issue.
Thank you. We are going to get now into which is going to be better for the first part of our discussion on reducing, if not eliminating, the greenwashing problem, data or technology. But Kate, do you want to say anything before we get into that particular discussion, given the fact that luckily it looks like you're back on the screen as you should be?
Sure, perfect. And apologies for that interruption, and many thanks to my fellow panelists for their introductions. I suppose just to set the scene from the perspective of the Irish government and why this topic is of great importance to us. Our own climate agenda has been emphasised by Ireland's Climate Finance Bill, which committed Ireland to the net zero target by 2050. And sustainability is also a very key pillar of IDA's own strategy, where we aim to basically adopt a sustainable approach to all investment and work very closely with our client companies on initiatives such as decarbonisation, responsible production, and transition to energy efficiency as much as we can. We also offer incentives and guide our clients around strategic transformation. For example, the way we do it is really through assistance in leadership supports, upskilling, and I suppose upskilling across very, very topical areas such as emerging technologies, such as responsible investing, and crucially, we connect them into the Irish ecosystem. In relation to today's theme, and I think it's very clear from my co-panelists' viewpoints that it's really very, very topical, and there's a lot of differing opinions on it. But in Ireland, we believe that the collaborative nature of our ecosystem that blends quite effectively financial technology, core technologies, and also core financial services companies makes us very uniquely positioned to develop our own sustainable finance industry and greenwashing detection industry. And it's a great privilege to be sharing the panel with two representatives of two great Irish companies today. Indeed, we believe that we actually have the strong capabilities and the foundations to become a centre for these types of activities in Europe, given our strong base and expertise in skill sets such as anti-money laundering, fraud detection, risk and compliance, and climate risk expertise. So we see the ESG data piece, the analytics piece, and greenwashing detection as the kind of natural extension of these capabilities that we can develop further in Ireland going into the future. So this important initiative will also draw strength from our reputation in the technology space, and some in the audience may be aware that 9 out of 10 top technology companies have presence in Ireland. And these companies are developing extensive research expertise and growing their emerging technologies capabilities in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing. So for us in IDA, the potential for advancing the corporate ESG agenda from Ireland using this unique blend between financial services, the traditional financial services, and the technology is really very obvious. So we look forward to working with new and existing clients in developing these opportunities in this exciting space.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to make an executive decision already because I'm already at the bottom of the hour and therefore in theory halfway through. So I'm going to take the first two questions almost together because I see we have a record number of questions. Some incredibly good questions have come in. So I want to try and at least time to tackle at least some of those. So Bobby, can I come to you first? And we have, as I've already mentioned, the SFDR coming along in the EU. We also have masses of things that we're going to be talking about in a second on the technology and the data side. For you, what do you think in terms of what's going to be the best way? It's going to be a combination of all of this, but what's going to be the best way of eliminating the greenwashing problem? And can I also ask you, for you, given what you do, how big a problem is it to begin with?
Yeah, sure. To take that question, or to take those questions in reverse order, in terms of how big a problem it is for us, well, firstly, I'm the CEO of 1FS Wealth, and our platform is designed to enable greenwashing detection for wealth owners. And the idea is that it allows them as wealth owners to determine whether a particular manager is compliant or not. And that applies to liquids and illiquids. And I think the illiquid side is so much more complicated. So I think it's a huge problem because people don't know where to start. And that's the reality. And we'll talk more about the data later on. But the fact of it is that the data is so disorganized. I'd actually use that word. You have so many different data sets, and you need to actually develop a platform which can disseminate and then harmonize, and then also run that data through the different frameworks. And there are umpteen frameworks as well. So you came back to that point about standardization. I think that will happen, but I think we're a long way off. And then in the context of your question about SFDR and the taxonomy, I think everyone should realize that, or remember that really the SFDR only came into play in March this year. And, you know, we have a timeline which goes out for the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, you have the 1st of Jan 22, level 2 disclosures. You then have for the taxonomy, again, another date in Jan 22. And then you've got another date for Jan 20, which is Jan 23 for the other 4 objectives, which I think are pollution and whatever. But the reality is that the SFDR has only come into play now. And there's a long way to go, but is it a good thing? I think it's a fantastic thing. I think both initiatives and all of these initiatives are wonderful, but what do you do with them? And it comes back to, I think, torturing the data. I think if you torture the data enough, it will actually prove to be useful. And I think I was told that by a data scientist, and I think it's so spot on. And we have oodles of data. What do you do with it?
Okay, well, that's a perfect lead into you, Ronan, in terms of what you do. How are you going to, people like you going to come along and save the day?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that term, to torture the data. I might use that. I had heard people talk about beating data into submission to get the answers they want, which is obviously the opposite extreme, where if you go too far. On the SFDR and regulations, I'm in favor of regulations, and I think it's got us all talking, right? It's got the whole industry moving in a certain direction now. There's going to be speed bumps along the way, but specifically on data, yeah, I'm a big so what we do at Eagle Alpha, we're about helping particularly the fund management industry find new interesting data, or alternative data as it's referred to in the industry. ESG is one of 26 categories for us. So, you know, we, long before, you know, we're having conversations around the complexity and sparseness of ESG data, we've been talking about that for all the data sets we work with, whether it's satellite data or social media data and so on. So that for us as a firm and for many of our clients, working with complex, messy data sets is not new. I think the challenge within ESG is the lack of consistent data reported from companies. So this is, the disclosures are often voluntary. They're often wordy statements where the only numbers are the page numbers. What we need is more quantitative data, I should say, something that's highly frequent, it's timely. But I think my personal opinion is that I don't place a lot of weight on what the companies say themselves above and beyond the audited or the factual information. I don't place a lot of weight. We would be big advocates for looking at external or alternative data. So examples of that, looking at patent data to understand are R&D dollars of the company actually going into environmentally friendly technologies, looking at employment data sets, to understand the makeup of the employee, the labor force, understand gender equality, the pay gaps, etc. And there's all the question of data versus tech is something we'll come back to, because there's a blurring of lines there, because tech can be important in order to create some of the data sets. And there we're talking about natural language processing to create a new time series based on unstructured data. And tech can also be important to analyze the data. So for me, it's, tech versus data is a difficult question, but maybe we'll come back to that in a more specific way later.
Can I come to you, Owen, for a response to that same question in terms of the data and technology and the regulation? How do they interplay with each other? And by the way, there's a I'm going to, as I said, I'll try and take the odd question as we go along. There's a question from somebody who's asked, should there be a simple rating system for retail investors on ESG funds? I never thought of that before. I think that sounds like that would be great for some data provider to do, come up with something simple and transparent. That would really make a big difference. But over to you, Owen. Don't forget to turn your mic on.
You would think that after 14 months of pandemic, I would remember to unmute myself. Apologies. If I can deal with the second part of the question, sorry, the second item you mentioned there, the question that's come in from a member of the audience there on ratings. I mean, there are actually lots of ratings around on funds. Several different providers. Morningstar do them. I think, yes, MSCI.
But sorry,
do them.
Just on ESG.
Yes, so Morningstar has their sustainability globes, for example. I mean, if you say sustainability is the same as ESG, and I think MSCI, I'm almost sure MSCI do something similar, and there will be more. But the key part of the question was simple, I suppose, and also whether I would add in whether you could trust them. I look at some of the ratings already out there, and I just think they need interpretation, and that probably brings me to the more substantive part of my answer, which is about data and whether what we can do about using data to eliminate greenwashing. And the problem I have is that, the intentions of something like SFDR are fantastic. I mean, an enormous amount of work has gone into putting in place regulations that will help investors, and I would say particularly retail investors, to understand and to understand really what's going on under the hood in the funds they might invest in, and to understand whether those funds are sustainable or not, broadly speaking. And it's very well intentioned, and I'm not sure if I sat down and tried to come up with a set of regulations I could do a whole lot better. I doubt it. But at the same time, data is data, and I do believe it needs strong interpretation. I mean, if you look at some of the questions, for example, take these principal adverse indicators that are a key part of SFDR. For anybody who isn't yet familiar, from the 1st of January, well, there's sort of, it depends on the exact dates, but broadly speaking, from next year, investors will have to report on a list of 14 different indicators, adverse indicators that their investments have on the environment, on society, and they have to give quantitative answers for that. And it'll be useful data, but it needs to be interpreted. So, for example, one of the indicators is the share of investments within a fund in companies that don't have a deforestation policy. So that's possibly useful. But if you're investing in, I don't know, a HR recruitment company, if you're investing in I'm trying to think, if you're investing in an investment manager, perhaps, well, maybe that's not the best example, but there are lots and lots of businesses. If a fund is made up of companies where deforestation is not particularly important or relevant to what they do, then that number is pretty much useless. A lot of those companies, if you're investing in technology, for example, a lot of those companies may not have a deforestation policy. It doesn't make them bad companies for a sustainable fund, and it doesn't mean that a fund that invests in those companies is not sustainable. I just don't think it's useful. On the other hand, of course, if it was, for example, an agribusiness company, or if it was a fund rather, or if it was a fund that was deeply involved in the agriculture sector or in some other sector that was very involved with deforestation and where that was important, then that would be a hugely important indicator. Even take something like the carbon footprint, which is the most basic indicator of all and the most advanced in terms of where there's plenty of data available. Even that can be very misleading. Take a clean energy fund. A clean energy fund will often have exposure to utilities that might have converted already 60, 70, 80, 90% of their electricity generation to a clean energy, but it might still have 10 or 20% left in legacy fossil fuels, which it's maybe phasing out. That company, a company that invests in utilities is going to have, a fund that invests in utilities, some of which still use fossil fuels, will have a sky high carbon footprint. And if you just take the number, and the number is reported at 976.25 or whatever it is, and the index is at 400 and something, then you say, well, that's not a sustainable fund because it is twice the carbon footprint of the benchmark. But then you have to look under the hood and understand why. It's because that fund invests in utilities. That particular fund is a clean energy fund. It's trying to invest as much as it can, as is possible to, in renewable energy. But because there's some legacy funds, legacy parts of those businesses that are still in fossil fuels, you have these problems. And I could go on and on. I won't. I'll spare you. But for each one of those indicators, it's great if there's a number. It's useful. It's better to have more numbers and more data than less. But every single one of those indicators, I believe, under SFDR, and every single number that's produced under taxonomy in terms of compliance with the taxonomy regulations as well, has to be interpreted. The human interpretation of the data is essential as well as the data. Having the data is a really important first step, but it's by no means the most important step, and it is certainly not the end of the road, it's the beginning.
Thank you for that. We rapidly, time is galloping on. I'm going to, again, try and take a couple of questions at the same time. And I'm wondering, the first one of these is, beyond what we've already discussed, if you are an investor and you're interested in investing, whether you're an institutional investor or even a retail investor, I'm going to challenge you all, every single one of you. I'm not hearing any simple, clear-cut solution to the problem. We're hearing about lots of data. Bobby's mentioned level 2 SFDR coming in. Maybe that is the answer. How can an investor who's very keen on, maybe a bit of an eco warrior, perhaps, how can he or she, let's say that's a retail investor, or an institutional investor that isn't that sophisticated, make sure, coming back to that quote from about horse meat in lasagna, making sure they're not buying the equivalent in a fund with a bit of horse meat in it. What can they do in simple, clear-cut terms? Anyone want to pick that up? Bobby.
Sure. I think we're talking about it in the wrong context, because the data is the data, and we are where we are, and we will continue to get data on funds, and I think it is back to interpretation, so I completely agree. But the way to look at it, I feel, is that if you are an investor in an instrument, whatever the instrument is, it comes back to your values firstly and foremostly, because you need to define what do you actually feel is important to you. Is it the E, is it the S or the G? Or is it climate, is it carbon, and so on? And we hear this a lot because we actually have people who say, well, actually, I don't particularly care about the G. I'm very focused on the E with this part of my portfolio. So actually allowing a user or consumer of the product to decide first and then have sensible data buckets that they can go to is really important. And I think those data buckets aren't perfect. And I think the way that you supplement them is actually through the use of NLP. So we've spoken about NLP already, but actually applying sentiment analysis as one of the strata, which is what we're doing, is a really powerful way, because that's an unbiased way of actually getting some raw data on a particular offering.
Okay. Before I let you go, Bobby, we'll go on to some other things. We did discuss in the prep called private equity, and investing in illiquids in general, including real estate. How on earth do you measure that? Coming back to, again, I'm going to overuse this quote of Molly, whatever her name is, the green professor, and her lasagna. How on earth do you monitor in the private equity world whether or not a GP is living up to the stated objectives that he or she has had in their fund? I know you said this is a big area for you, private equity.
Yeah, exactly. And then actually you mentioned RE, so real estate first, if I may. That's actually becoming a lot more measurable. And the reason is because if you compare a Victorian grade 2 listed building versus a modern build, you have sustainability metrics that you can apply, particularly in the States. They're actually pretty good at it. So you have triple glazed units for the windows and so on. And so you have levels of insulation. So you can actually measure these real estate assets and you can start comparing them. And it's not perfect by any means, but it's getting better. For PE, it's a bit more difficult and it's nascent. And I think that you have to assess the GP as a whole in terms of what is their strategy and then what are they deploying into, what portfolio holdings do they have? And is there any data available? No, not for the most part. And I think that will develop. And I think there's a wave behind it. And so because we have that momentum there, I think it's all of our duty to ensure that continues with respect to data harvesting. And as to who harvests the data, is it technology companies such as Ronan and us, or is it actually forced upon us by the regulators? And I feel it's a combination of the two. Thank you.
I'm going to ask. Go on, please.
Yeah. I was just going to jump in on the private equity. I think if you have an approach that is less reliant on company disclosed data, well, then it's easier to apply that to a private equity world. So if you're, the data set, the type of categories I mentioned before, like employment data sets and patent or patent data, that applies to public and private companies. The NLP that Bobby talked to, if you're analyzing news flow, maybe social media data, information from NGOs, that doesn't rely on company disclosure, so it doesn't really matter if it's private or public. But I totally get when you're looking at public companies, not always, but quite frequently you're looking at smaller companies that maybe have less data. On the real estate side, I agree with Bobby. From an environmental perspective, it's actually probably one of the most advanced asset classes in terms of the disclosures. But I think what's not captured are the social considerations within real estate. Access to housing for lower income families, the gentrification of areas, that means that people can no longer live where they grew up. The Georgian house example, maybe some people consider Georgian houses as part of the social assets, or those Georgian houses are in some way more ESG friendly than a modern build. So I think there's a certain green lensing or carbon lensing when it comes to the real estate space that's not capturing the S or maybe the G.
Simon, if I can also come in,
sure.
just on that, I suppose for, obviously data underpins everything. And, the way we see it is it's the amount and the granularity of information is what will give companies essentially much richer insights and analytical capabilities. And obviously not just the investor and the company itself, but also the consumer, giving transparency and ability to choose more accurately in accordance with their values. What we see in Ireland, for example, is we see some really pioneering research into techniques such as using artificial intelligence in developing specific tools to identify greenwashing. So something quite similar to Bobby's 1FS, but within more, I suppose, more academic domain. And as Ronan pointed out, there's great scope for using NLP techniques, for example, by training models based on taxonomy words or ESG risk criteria. And I know a number of clients are already exploring that space from Ireland. one technology that hasn't actually been mentioned, but it also offers some really interesting capabilities is actually blockchain, and it's not possibly immediately apparent in the ESG context, but it is being deployed in interesting ways, such as real-time ESG data tracking, so real-time ESG reporting, which is something that will be important, I think, going forward, particularly as we develop harmonization and, you know, further develop our standards across the ESG analytics. You know, the current reporting mechanisms allow for annual reporting, which I think in the current context simply lack the sense of urgency that we need to address with impeding climate change. So yeah, so and blockchain, you know, separate to that, also offers some really interesting ways to explore that S&G piece of ESG, I think, because it offers that transparency and ability to look into the social and the governance elements of analytics.
Thank you. Before I hand back to Karina, I would like to come to you, Owen, and ask you, pick up on something you said earlier, which I completely agree with, but I want to challenge you as well, which is, you said most asset managers aren't necessarily trying to do something wrong. I'm sure that's absolutely correct, but using this term that I've used a couple of times about governance washing, can I say this as one middle-aged white man to another middle-aged white man? It's not because anyone's trying to be nefarious necessarily or doing something dodgy, although there may have been a bit of marketing spinning in terms of some of the funds that have gone out there with an ESG label on that weren't all that ESG when you really looked into it at the end of the day. But do you think the problem is that it's just a generational thing, that people who are currently in charge, they really don't think they need to change that much? I talked about the peripatetic nature of the European industry, but God knows how much carbon goes into the production of a European ESG fund, you know, for example, and with the diversity or the lack of it, which, and the Refinitiv published a thing called, it's now become very, very well known, called their D&I index, which is the top 100 most diverse and inclusive companies. Whilst there are plenty of firms like KPMG and Accenture and all those others that do very well in that, there's only one single fund manager in the top 100, that's BlackRock. So, you know, I would say by any measure, the fund industry is a bit behind the curve. So over to you, what's your response to that?
Oh, what a great question. We could have a seminar on that alone. A couple of quick points on it. I suppose one thing I would say is that nothing focuses the mind on an issue so much as your customers wanting it. So even if you took the view, and maybe I shouldn't say even, but if you take the view that this industry is not remotely as diversified as it should be, and I wouldn't argue with you on that, because I think the evidence is on your side on that issue. If customers want it, they'll get it. And whether if they want sustainability, if they want their investments to focus for even specifically on the issue of diversity and equality, then fund managers, whether they're middle-aged and white or whether they're young and non-white, will have the same focus, because that's where they're going to make the money from their customers. So I think what you say is true as a fact that it is not a very well diversified industry. I'm not sure that has a huge impact on outcomes, because it's very clear to me. I mean, I'm in the role of head of responsible investing at our firm for actually, I'm not quite sure, I think it's about 8 years now. And I would say that it would be an exaggeration to say that interest in ESG in each of those 8 years has doubled relative to the year before, but it wouldn't be much of an exaggeration. I mean, this is absolutely, interest in this topic is growing at an absolutely exponential rate. And when you ask yourself why, well, it isn't because the middle-aged white men running investment managers suddenly got interested in climate for the first time. It's because their clients have. And the clients of investment managers are now hugely focused on this issue. Why? The honest answer is nobody knows for sure. It may well be because the the millennial generation is moving into more senior management roles, becoming more influential, and therefore they want their pension funds, their investments, and everything they do to be more focused on sustainable issue, because we know that generation is more interested in these issues than older generations. That could be the reason. It could even be because as time passes, women are taking a larger and larger, just like the millennial generation, women are becoming a larger proportion of the workforce, a larger proportion of the senior workforce, and they tend to be more interested in these issues. There is some evidence to indicate that. It could be, some people say it's the impact of the financial crisis, which showed people how when the financial system doesn't get it right, it has a huge impact on the rest of society. I don't know the reason, but certainly the fact that there is an explosion of interest amongst the end investors in this topic, to me, is probably more of a driver than the racial or age makeup of senior managers within investment manager firms. They will follow the money, and it certainly helps if they're interested in the topic. It certainly helps if they believe in the importance of addressing climate change, for example. But if that's what their clients want, they won't care. They'll follow that way anyway. To be absolutely cynical and brutal about it, but I think that's the reality.
Thanks. Over to you, Karina. I've left you with a huge number of questions, which we haven't even got to. So how are you going to do that in the minutes we have left?
Okay, so some very interesting questions coming in around the skill sets that are developing to address the needs of this growing ESG industry. And an interesting question about competency washing. Apologies, I can't even say it. So in terms of industry professionals who are upskilling themselves with some ESG knowledge, maybe some qualifications, and then calling themselves experts. And Bobby, you guys are hiring at the minute. What do you think about that?
Sure, I think it's wholly valid. I think that we've seen, similar to fund prospectuses, the words ESG pasted onto CVs. And you're thinking, well, hang on, where did that come from? And I think that you've got to look at it again from two perspectives. I think it's good that people actually want to get into ESG and everything surrounding it, so they actually do want to upskill, and that's healthy. And I've actually interviewed candidates, and they've said, look, the area that we're passionate about is ESG, and that's great to hear. And you want to cultivate that. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be a case of you're hiring people and they really haven't got the credentials that they claim. And so I think it is an industry issue. As to how you tackle it, I think it comes back to careful filtering of staff, and I think that's the only way. So I think for the most part, it's good that there's so much interest around it, and we want it to continue. I think that's the point.
Okay.
But I had a quick anecdote to that. Oh, go ahead.
I just simply wanted to say that I suppose one of the ways we are addressing that in Ireland by basically working very closely with our client companies, specifically on upskilling and also on executive programs to make sure that this doesn't happen, and that credentials are well deserved. And we have a very specific body which is called SkillNet, who are, they're effectively another state agency, but they work very closely with our client companies on indeed identifying those niche skill sets within a particular company, and working with the company on developing executive and targeted programs with a view to respond better to the challenges of the skills shortages. And actually, I think, Owen, you might have some additions on that. I know KBI participated on this program.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually, because it was fantastic for us. I mean, this time last year, Sustainable Skills Net Ireland said to us, as sort of a COVID initiative, really, when people were at home and maybe would have the time or be able to dedicate blocks of time to do this, that we could make available a specific ESG or training course available to all staff. So we made it available to all staff. I thought we might get 10 or 12 people might take it up. More than half of our entire company took up the option to do this detailed online ESG training. They weren't under any pressure to do so. It was simply made available as an option. And I was just blown away by the level of interest. I wouldn't be so arrogant as to say that came down to being our firm. We were far more interested than anybody else. I suspect other investment managers probably had a similar experience. And you could take that, you could be a little cynical about that and say it's people trying to put something on their CV to look good for ESG purposes. Why always be cynical? Why not say that more than 50% took advantage of the opportunity to upskill themselves in a really important area? I thought it was a fantastic initiative, and we were delighted that Skillsnet Ireland did it, and it was great from our point of view. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Owen. Folks, I'm afraid we are going to have to round up. We had a lot of really interesting questions, a record number in this seminar. We will try and incorporate those into the white paper, so please look out for that. Thank you again to IDA Ireland for kindly hosting today's seminar. Really looking forward to the next one on the 17th of June. If you'd like to find out more about ESG opportunities in Ireland, we'd love to connect you with the fantastic team from IDA Ireland, and contact details will be included in our follow-up email. So thank you again to our panel. Thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and wish you an enjoyable rest of the day and a great weekend coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.